I've been on the Blockly team for a little over a year now, and I'm going to talk to you about how I try to make focus management a little bit better. So for the most part, I kind of want to mainly focus on talking about how we've had to re-implement some of this core machinery that Christopher was talking about. I'm not going to be doing like a super deep dive into the machinery itself, because if it's working correctly, it should just work, and it really shouldn't impact anything outside of core. But I do want to tie specifically to the problem space of screenreader, how it ties in both to the work that the team's done in the past and what's coming up in the future, and talk a little bit about some of the parts that may actually bleed a little bit outside of core. So the overview is that the goal that I'm ultimately trying to work toward with Focus is that end users that have no light perception at all and have to completely rely on screen readers are able to use Blockly effectively. We've talked a lot about mixed mode, but there is this big question of, okay, if you have to completely rely on a screen reader, how do we make that part work? Your vision is not going. This is an intentional image, because the idea is that we are going to explain Focus and how we've made it a little bit better. Let's back up and talk about the background a little bit here for those that aren't familiar. What is an actual screen reader? Well, fundamentally, this is a piece of software that's running alongside an application. It has deep hooks into the UI. It's able to provide some additional context and visual cues, or audio cues or textual output, ideally to provide the same amount of context as a fully visual user who doesn't have any impairments and doesn't have to rely on the output. In the web world, these deep hooks are primarily around DOM element focus and specific properties on the element that we'll talk about a little bit more. But that kind of has a natural follow-up question of what is actually focus. Christopher did a good job starting the introduction on what this is. But from a technical perspective, focus is just a DOM state on an element that the browser is saying this is the thing that the user cares about right now. Technically, this enables keyboard input, so text input fields and stuff like that. But it also provides, by default, a visual highlight. So you can also technically focus things like text areas that don't have input, because it is like the single element that's important right at this moment. When we're talking about enabling screen reader support in general applications, the most fundamental ways of navigating through the page is using tab index. And you literally are pressing the tab key in order to switch which element currently has focus. Or you can click on them, because when you click on an element, it automatically gains focus as well. This is for like text input. But when we're thinking about this in terms of keyboard navigation, and as we started like pulling out this thread of what do we need to make screen readers work, we tied it back to screen readers rely on focus. The thing that's focus is the thing that they're looking at to pull the context in order to generate the audio cues. We need to then say, well, what you have selected in Blockly with keyboard navigation has DOM focus so that it actually connects through. That's the idea anyway. That's what should work. And so then the next kind of conclusion is we need to have some way of synchronizing this. If you are navigating with keyboard navigation, we need to force the thing that you have selected to also have DOM focus. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but the web world has this concept of tab indexes. And in general, there's actually kind of two different tab indexes. There's a 0 tab index and there's a -1 tab index. The dichotomy here is actually very important, because normally web applications rely entirely on tab index. Because if you are following web accessibility best practices, you add ARIA labels, you add additional context around the roles of the thing that you're using, or a lot of that's automatic, and you just set tab index so that you can just tab through stuff with the tab keys. This works really well. In Blockly, though, tab is not sufficient. We need to do more. We need to have a lot more control over, or we need to provide a lot more control over being able to navigate. And so there's actually this element of setting things to 0 or -1 tab index based on the context, as well as the fact that users could just suddenly leave that area, give focus to something else on the screen that's not part of Blockly, and we need to be able to synchronize that back. So we need some sort of utility to make all that work. And that's what this concept of focus manager is. Ultimately, the purpose is to manage the synchronization between the DOM and Blockly and have a single source of truth for what is currently the thing that matters in Blockly, the thing that currently should have focus. From a technical perspective, this is fueled by these two new interfaces called focusable node and focusable tree. The specifics of this aren't necessarily that important. This is just sort of like the general structure of how this works. Nodes are things that you can directly select or interact with that are important, things like a field or a block or a bubble. Trees are this concept of context, which I'll actually show in a couple slides with a visual because it's a little bit easier to understand. Other requirements, as we were sort of pulling on this thread and trying to understand it better, is we need to be able to visually distinguish what we call active versus passive focus. Active is the thing that the user currently has focus on. This is like a normal, I care about this element, this block. Passive focus is the thing I did have focus on in a different context. This distinction is very important when you're dealing with things like block insertion. There's a thing that we call ephemeral focus. This is the idea that you want to open a field editor or some sort of prompt or something like that. You need to be able to take away control of keyboard input and focus from Blockly, but also be able to restore it back when you're done. And then there's this notion of tab index management. This is the idea that you can tab to something, like the workspace, and then be able to start enabling, it automatically enables keyboard navigation at that point, but you need to be able to tab away from it. And so we actually have to control which elements are tabbable versus non-tabbable, and that's completely separate from the being able to move around with keyboard navigation. So this visual is meant to sort of better explain focus types. On the left, as you saw in Christopher's demo, when something is actively focused, it gets this full filled border. But when it's passively focused, it gets a dotted line border on the right. This is because the context is switched. In the left image, the context is the workspace, but in the right image, the context is the toolbox. And so we're providing a visual indicator where you're returning to. As with any system, there are things that get easier and things that get harder. As for what sort of gotten easier, because we have this notion of what is the current thing that matters for user input, for user interaction, the internal implementation for selection actually got a lot simpler. It actually doesn't really exist anymore. It's just abstracted away to focus. The cursor that Christopher was talking about also has gotten a lot simpler. We no longer need to have a visual representation of where the user is on the screen because we can just use focus. And work that Aaron has done has also moved navigation logic out of the cursor. So that entire construct that existed previously for keyboard navigation sort of doesn't need to exist anymore, and actually won't eventually. Now, where focus is meant to just work, it turns out it doesn't. And it turns out it doesn't in very interesting ways. This is meant to just be a very brief like sort of glimpse into that. One aspect is Blockly handles a lot of pointer events and mouse-related input events in order to handle dragging, and it disables propagation as part of that, which means when you click on something, the browser normally gives that thing focus even if it has a tab index, but not in Blockly. So we had to add additional hooks to ensure that those things get focused properly. Another one that's interesting is that there are cases where we move elements around, bring to front, move to drag layer, and when you move an element that has focus to a new parent, it loses focus. And it turns out in Chrome, you get a blur event. In Firefox and Safari, you do not. So you just don't have any indicator that you lost focus. So that's kind of fun. And then something I learned like 2 weeks ago is that when you read the tab index property, it turns out it defaults to 0 or -1 depending on the element type, even if it's not defined. So it lies to you, which is kind of fun when you're writing tests, if you don't mind losing an afternoon. And then CSS styling is easy, right? That's had some interesting problems. And thanks to Matt and the audience for making the CSS styling and the keyboard navigation plugin much better. This slide sort of is meant to encapsulate things where focus-related changes actually do start kind of leaving the core boundary into like plugins or custom integrations. Ideally, none of this should affect you, but we've already had a couple cases where ephemeral focus is broken, cases where drop-down and widget divs were used at the same time. There's also theoretical cases with custom icons, fields, toolbox items that Aaron talked about, and custom context menu actions that could have problems. I'm not going to talk about all the specifics of that, but if you run into problems, file an issue, please. And we're working on improving the documentation around focus as well, so hopefully that helps preempt some of the problems. Well, what comes next? It turns out that screenreader now works today in V12. It doesn't work well, though. And my caveat is I only tested it on Chromevox. So it works because we are now synchronizing focus correctly. And so the browser knows what is important when the screenreader's on. Or sorry, the screenreader knows what's important when it's on because it knows what's focused. The problem is that it doesn't read out something that's useful. So the next steps are primarily going to be around introducing the proper ARIA labeling and roles. ARIA being sort of like the fundamental thing to provide that core context for semantic meaning to elements in order for the screenreader to provide the right output or useful output. And this is not going to be the end. This is just to get this into a state where we can start really testing it. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more that we'll have to do after that, but it's like not that far away actually, which is kind of exciting. There's also some components that still need to be made focusable and navigable, some of which this is ongoing, some of this hasn't started quite yet. And there are some optimizations. It turns out that if you increase certain event firing thresholds by 6x, some people get unhappy with you. So there's a little bit of work more to do there. But overall, that's sort of the premise. Any questions?
Great job. As we develop our functionality to work with the new focusability and the new and all this work, what kind of ARIA tags are we going to need to add to our and what kind of accessibility features are we going to need to add? So, for example, if we create a new block type, are we going to have? Is there going to be a place in the API to put the ARIA tag so that it gets rendered correctly when rendered by Blockly? Or are there other places that we need to think about in terms of what we need to do to complement the work that your team is doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is some support already in a bunch of the different Blockly components for ARIA roles, actually. They're not exactly hooked up quite, they're not seamlessly hooked up with Focus Manager in that system yet. This is actually really the next thing I'm going to be thinking about. There may need to be some stuff for custom cases. I suspect there will be. It's not clear what that's going to look like yet. And ideally, we're going to try to do it in a way, we need to do it in a way that doesn't introduce an API breakage as well. And then there might be a nicer way to do that in V13, but we will figure that out and communicate it as needed. And probably also try to have a reasonable default so that it at least works okay, maybe not perfect though, for upgrades.
First, great talk. It's fairly exciting and got to upgrade to be able to use this. The question I have, so let's say inside of our block editor, we have a little gear or something that then pops up a modal, but that modal is kind of within our third-party environment. What is there types of hooks that you imagine that we'll have to implement to say, okay, now that focus is outside and on a modal that's happens to be above the Blockly environment when they close it, then provide Blockly focus again, or yeah, how do you imagine that type of back and forth working with the kind of third-party environments?
Does the modal have Blockly things in it, or is it just
Let's assume it does not.
Okay, this is where ephemeral focus comes into play.
Yeah.
And this is exposed in the public API for V12. You can use ephemeral focus manually, and you can look at examples in core to see how that's used. Most cases don't have to use it if you're using dropdown div or widget div, because it hooks up automatically. But if you're doing something really custom, you can then just emulate the same thing, and it should just work today.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So this is a little more maybe pie in the sky, but I gather that strictly speaking, what happens with a screen reader is, you'll have an ARIA label, say, on a block, and it'll maybe read out the message associated, the labels and the blocks, so it can tell somebody sort of what type of block it is, right? But one of the goals, it seemed, of screen reading, sort of in general, is to be able to provide the same kind of context that sighted people might have. And there's sort of at least two different kinds of contexts. One is the details of that block per se. But one thing that sighted users of Blockly can do is they can kind of look at the contents, say, of a loop or a function definition and have a notion of, okay, I have an idea of what this thing does, like independent of having to go through every element, right? There's a sort of a gestalt, right, that you can just kind of see if you're experienced enough. I wonder if you've thought about ways to provide that sort of level of context to sort of equalize, the playing field. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I've thought about this a little bit, and more from like the how do we make this possible, because I think there's going to be elements of there that are going to eventually be necessary, and this comes into like the further testing once we get the initial thing out the door. But I know Rachel's thought about this a lot more than I have.
Yeah, so the framework that we use for this is POR, so perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Giddings, ARIA, and all of that is what we're doing for robust, because that technically is robust for everything else. Operable is the keyboard shortcut part of it. And then perceivable, also screenreader hits perceivable, but what you're getting at is understandable, which is what's the meaning of this. And ARIA helps with that some, because it helps with like saying it's semantic labels, so this is an input for numbers, but it won't help fully. I think that we need it to be that you can say, that you have another shortcut that you can press to say, where am I? And that gives you contextual information. And I think that there's an entire really, truly interesting research area here of deciding what that should be. From the Blockly side, I actually really suspect that it's basically we have a function and you guys have to fill it out and we give you the information about where you are in the blocks, because it's really going to be specific to each application, how they describe different levels of complexity. But at minimum, you should be able to say, where am I? And get an answer that's like, you're on stack 1 of 3, or you are in a loop block, or you are editing a loop block, and so on and so forth. And that actually, what we want to do with that is parallel to what you do with screen readers right now, where you get things like you're on element n of whatever within a list.
Yeah, and I guess I was just imagining maybe even another level where you could plug in an AI, for example, that actually sort of read the blocks and said, yeah, I think this is a function that does this, right? I mean, hopefully you've named your function, but maybe you haven't, right? And it kind of has to figure it out.
Christopher also has something to say here.
I was going to say, we actually did some experiments a while ago using LLMs to summarize blocks. When you collapse a block, it tries to tell you what the collapsed block means. And I would say it was far from working perfectly, but there's some promise there. So actually, your idea of trying to get some intelligent descriptions of locations, that might be something that could work.
Simple question. Do you support multi-select, maybe?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Multi-select, when you are selecting a block.
No, but it is something that we're thinking about, and I didn't cover it. I didn't mention it in the talk, but like part of the design in this is anticipating multi-select, but there will be additional work we still have to do there, and it's not currently on the roadmap. There is also a plugin, but I have not tested it with Focus.
Songlin emailed on the forum just, I believe, yesterday to ask about necessary APIs for updating that, and we need to respond. But yes, we want multi-select. One of the fascinating problems here is selection following focus or not. Multi-select just makes that harder, because now you're like, what is selected? We're looking at that. Gonna take some design to get it right.
Hello, Tom Ball. So in syntax-directed editing, you often have a cursor model, which you sort of have, but do you have a notion of like a hole and what can fit in the hole? Like if I'm in a Boolean expression, then only certain blocks are viable. do I still have like the whole paradigm that I take a block and I try to fit it in, and if it doesn't fit, or can you make it context sensitive? So, for example, if I'm in a Boolean hole, then it's going to be, hey, logic expression. So I haven't played around enough to know about that.
Yeah, insertion is contextual right now.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that means that if I hit a I when I'm at a Boolean place, it'll only show up.
When you're navigating through the connections that it can go, it won't let you put it in a place where it can't go.
Right. And okay, I should play more with that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to take a little stab at that, what you're requesting is like reducing the toolbox selection according to where you are. Yeah. We've certainly talked about that. It is something that we might do. There's probably an issue open for it. I think one of the reasons that hasn't been a priority is we moved from the location first paradigm to the block first paradigm as the main thing we wanted to work on. So if you pick the block, we can find the places it goes to ones that work. It is possible we can do it the other way around. There's no reason in principle we couldn't do it. It just hasn't been a priority for us.
Thank you for your focus.